Our own Seamus Hosey wrote, "The ghosts of the Lalor family gather at Tinnakill this weekend." Isn't it fitting that on the opening night of the James Fintan Lalor Autumn School, we have the ghost of the man himself here tonight, James Fintan himself, appearing in a live show written by Mike Finn and specially commissioned for the occasion.
I would love to see change. I'd love to see this school being part of bringing about that change, that we'd learn from the past, that we get to know the past, both sides of it. Be proud of it, because it's our story whether we like it or not. And if a sense of leishness come out of it, that would be great. And I think too, if we learned some historical lessons from landlordism and from greed and trying to recoup investments. And while we sometimes think bad of landlords and we decry the British landlords who ruled us for so many hundreds of years, I think we should look too into our own hearts. When we thought we were rich here a few years ago on the Celtic Tiger, and when people bought property abroad, and actually Irish people became landlords. And I just wonder if all of us looked into our hearts, and those who bought property and panicked and charged people abroad high prices for it would remember the historical context and indeed the historical irony of that. And maybe we might learn a lesson that would be of use to this country in the future.
It's a great honour and privilege for me to be here tonight with the children of Raheen National School, and I would like to invite them now on stage. Lovely warm welcome for us. Ladies and gentlemen, the children of Shomra Baha and Oige from Skull Tubberan Lane, and they have worked so hard on their great fellow Laois patriot, James Fintan Lalor.
I am in a cell with a small window and a bunk bed. I plead every day for paper and pen. I often dream at night when I am frozen in my narrow bed of my beautiful room on the 3rd floor of my lovely home, Tinnakill House. I used to sit for hours at my desk and write for hours. And when I looked out the window, I could see all across Clonfada and Clunkeen, with the birds singing and the rivers flowing.
To tonight's programme. Tonight we're going to talk to a political essayist from County Laois whose short life belies the contribution that he made, the influence that he had, that his writings had on Irish history. Admired by men like John Mitchell, Pádraig Pearse, James Connolly, for example, James Fintan Lalor was one of the most original thinkers of the Young Ireland movement, and we're delighted that he's been able to travel across the years to be here with us tonight. Would you please welcome Mr. James Fintan Lalor. Welcome to the programme. Have a seat. It's an honour to have you here.
The last such meeting I attended was at Holy Cross, in the county of Tipperary, for the purpose of establishing a league of tenant farmers.
Yes, well, tonight will be rather less formal than that.
It was, as I recall it, in the year 1847. I was harangued by a scoundrel by the name of William Connor. The platform collapsed, and I had to be carried to a nearby tavern to be resuscitated. My object is to repeal the conquest. Not any part or portion, but the whole and entire conquest of 700 years. That the absolute ownership of the lands of Ireland is vested of right in the people of Ireland. That they, and none but they, are the first landowners as well as the lawmakers of this island. Ireland her own, and all therein, from the sod to the sky, the soil of Ireland for the people of Ireland, to have and to hold from God alone who gave it. 1 million of men stood there. What did they do? speculated, spouted, cheered, resolved, declared, petitioned, and adjourned.
Now, in the same article, you go on to describe how the effects of the famine were, well, the effects that they were having on small farmers. They were playing into the hands of the landlords who were using the disaster to clear their land of tenants.
Such was the case, for there was a sort of revolution beginning which would leave Ireland without a people, unless it be met and conquered by a revolution which would leave it without landlords. Yes, the land, always the land, and its ownership from the sod to the sky.
The rent strike you mentioned, how did you see that working?
There were 4 elements to it. One, that in order to save their own lives, the occupying tenants of the soil of Ireland ought, the following autumn, to refuse all payment of rent and arrears of rent then due. 2, that they ought to refuse and resist being made landless beggars under the English law of ejectment.
This was because if tenants sought any aid or assistance during the famine, they would have to get out of their holdings in order to get it.
That is correct. And 3, that they ought further, on principle, to refuse to pay any rent until the people had met in National Congress to decide what rents they were to pay and to whom they were to pay them. And 4, that the people, on grounds of policy and economy, ought to decide that those rents should be paid to themselves, the people, for public purposes.
And as a result, the last 2 articles you wrote were they were entitled Resistance and Clearing the Decks. They have a real sense of urgency about them.
I often fear it argues an utter absence of heroism from the national temperament. Elsewhere they serve their country for their country's thanks or their country's tears. Here they serve it for their country's money.
Porrick Pierce said of you that your new gospel was self-luminous, delivered in the ringing voice of an angel. The Lord God must have inspired the poor crippled recluse, for no mortal man could of himself have uttered the things he uttered. The present crisis was caused to a large extent by land, by landlords, by developers, by speculators. Would it be fair to say that in nearly 170 years, nothing has changed?
Let laws and institutions say what they will. This fact will be stronger than all laws and prevail against them. The fact that those who own your lands will make your laws and command your liberties and your lives. Those who own your lands will make your laws and command your liberties and your lives.
On behalf of Laois Partnership, and as a native of Raheen and a descendant of a tenant farmer, I'm very pleased to be here today at the inaugural summer school for James Fintan Lalor. And I'm very pleased that Laois Partnership could make some funding available towards the hosting of the event.
Isn't it great that we have here in Port Laois the James Fintan Lalor Avenue, and we have the James Fintan Lalor Monument, we have the James Fintan Lalor Inaugural School, and we hope that it's the first school of many, 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 many years to come, that it'll be an annual event.
When he passed to his eternal reward at the early age of 42, the people of Ireland had lost a true friend who, by his zeal for justice, had infused into the people a bitter hatred of the system by which a privileged few could dominate the whole population of a country. Now, in the clamour of voices crying out to be heard in the political turmoil, agitation, and tragic course of a lot of the history of Ireland in the 19th century, one clear voice stands out, asserting that national independence could never be achieved at the expense of social justice. Seamus Dean says that Lalor's writings makes a distinction between the soil of Ireland, you know, as some kind of metaphysical, spiritual inheritance, and the land which was a political and legal entity. You know, you could possess the soil spiritually, but you had to own the land physically. There's no point in talking about repeal or reform or unless we sort out the ownership of the land. And that is the basis on which all social justice and all human rights and equality are based. Words alone are certain good. And also, in another of Yeats's lines, in dreams begin responsibilities. In James Fintan Lalor's life and his writings, we have the words and the dreams. Today, in 2013, and in our discussions here in Portlaoise today, as we celebrate a controversial figure and someone who has, I think, been rightly brought into the forefront of our consciousness in recent years, we're celebrating someone in the knowledge that we too have the words. We too still have the dreams. Let us now talk about our responsibilities. Thank you.
You might legitimately ask, of course, what relevance does James Fintan Lalor have to us today? And we could contrive, I suppose, to simplify what was a complex life. We should be wary, of course, of linking the past and present and making parallels between the past and the present, Ireland of the 1840s and Ireland now, in a bogus way. But after his death, of course, he was reinterpreted. And he was reinterpreted as a revolutionary socialist, as a champion of working class democracy, as an evangelist of Irish nationalism. And we've heard how people like David and Pearse and Connolly sought to use him and his legacy. But we still have to be reminded that the impact that he had on events in his life was relatively limited. We still have that feeling today of desiring, many of us, of desiring new departures. And many, looking at Ireland in crisis at various stages, sought to invoke the words, the memory, the ghost of James Fintan Lalor, because they wanted those new departures. He was a man of ideas. He was somebody who had an acute concern for the poor, for the less well off and for their welfare. He was somebody who believed in a programme that gave a central role to reform. It seems to me that a lot of what Lalor was trying to do was link politics, economy and society, that they could not and should not have been seen as separate spheres. One of the things that infuriated me, not just as a citizen but also as a historian, was the common use of the phrase at the outset of the crisis, "We are where we are." That would be a red flag to the historian bull, because we want to know, of course, why we are where we are. But the challenge coming out of any crisis, whether it was in the 1840s or whether it is now, is to respond with some new vision, some new ideas.
The management of our economic crisis over the past number of years now poses major questions of Lalor's green wreaths for Irish society. And that question is threefold: economically, socially and politically. Lalor addressed this issue himself in 1848 when he opined that written constitutions and statutory laws were mere paper and parchment and of no value without what he described as a social constitution, as referred to by Diarmaid.
Perhaps it is time to step back and re-evaluate and reimagine the country and the way we are governed. The government is promising reforms, but where is the debate? We need a whole new debate on responsibility, accountability and transparency. And a debate not confined to Parliament or the council chambers, but open to all, and most of all, approached with open minds.
Well, for a start, let's dare to dream. This year is 100 years after the 1913 lockout. And in 1913, the poor of Dublin dared to dream of a better future, a future where they would have decent housing and have decent rights in terms of employment. In 1916, the leaders then dared to dream of a republic that would cherish all the children of the nation equally. I think that we must draw our strength and our inspiration from these people who dared to dream in their time. I think we must dare to dream now of a new republic from sod to sky that will serve the interests of the majority of Irish people and deliver fairness, equality and fulfilment to the vast majority of the Irish people.
Democracy is very fragile, but it is very precious. Equally, trust is very fragile and is very precious. And I would be always one that would have stood up for that interaction between the local politician, the TD politician in his constituency.
And that's extraordinary devotion to duty now to spend the Friday night reading the National Recovery Plan. It's better than watching the Late Late Show anyway.
For those of you who weren't there last night, we had an extraordinary cultural event and an extraordinary community event, because we had Portlaoise seizing on to an idea, which was to celebrate a local dignitary who'd been more or less ignored for a very long time, like 160 years or whatever it was, and actually have a political conversation around him. And we had this extraordinary dramatic thing produced by, where's Miles Dungan? Oh, there, yeah, Miles and his colleagues. We had James Fintan Lalor coming to life in a series which I hope is going to be with us forever. Miles has started interviewing the dead. We have virtually no investigative journalists, is my contention. Now, my colleagues, some of whom know an awful lot about this, may differ. But the fact is we are completely and utterly trammeled by libel laws. It's bad in the United Kingdom. It's infinitely worse there. I am sick and tired since I took up journalism of people saying, why haven't you got the courage to say X and Y? Because the lawyers take it out. I have had several libel actions taken against my newspapers about things I said that I would say were true. But either they paid people 10,000 quid just to go away and not bother them, which had lots more people coming along and threatening to sue again, or they lost incredibly expensive actions in the courts, and juries of the people awarded extraordinary amounts because they think that libel damages grow on some little fairy lights place. They don't realise they come from newspapers and that ultimately they'll kill newspapers.
The press barons of today are, to some extent, latter-day landlords in the spirit of this school, and to suggest perhaps that they have equally as much bearing and as control and influence on our lives and our freedom as perhaps the less benign landlords of yesteryear had. All politics is local. That remains true, and certainly I certainly still prefer to get coverage in the Leinster Express than in the dailies. It's nice to get a headline here and there, but if it's not in the Leinster, it hasn't happened.
If you put two people in a room, immediately you have politics, because you have two people, for whatever reason, are vying for power, whether that is personal power, whether it is, as we saw earlier on here with Charlie Flanagan and Mary O'Rourke, it could be party political power. It could be the kinds of issues that you were talking about here yourselves earlier on today, the struggle for survival that so many people are involved in at the moment. And it could also be the kind of struggles that James Fintan Lalor was interested in, which was the power of self-determination. But in this country at the moment, not very many people are in that position because they are so caught up at the moment in the struggle for survival. So you have two people in a room. You bring in a third person, and that third person is the observer or the reporter. And the fourth person in the room is the audience. And we have become, over the years, used to the idea that the observer in the room is not partisan, that the observer in the room is somebody who is there on our behalf to find out truths and tell them to us. But all of those people in the room are doing a job, which is not necessarily their own person. The politician is not a politician 24 hours a day. The journalist has a family. The observer has a life of their own, a job of their own as well. We are all human beings, and that room is a grey room. You may have noticed in national media that the Midlands does not get a look in. In the last 2 or 3 years, you can forget about seeing anything from this area here, Laois, Offaly, Westmeath, making it into the national newspapers, unless it's sexy or there's some peculiar odd thing that has happened. It's not going to. You won't see it in the national paper. But what you will see that's of relevance to everybody is all of the politics with a small p, the kinds of things that you can make choices about and that we can make choices about as journalists and as citizens. For example, the casual misogyny in society and indeed also in media, for example. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a man in his underwear on the magazine section of the Sunday Independent. I certainly haven't. There are no poor people in the media. There are no people of colour that I have ever seen reporting in this country. I could name Dil Vikramanse on News Talk and Spichek Zielinski are the only non-Irish people who are reporting in this country. That's not representative of the country that we live in. And that's politics with a small p. We have absolutely no oversight of what's happening in the EU in any of our media, which is an extraordinary thing considering that more than half of the legislation that affects how we live our lives every day comes from the EU. Lawyers in this country are extraordinarily powerful. And if you write a story that is well researched and you can prove all the information that you have and an expensively paid legal firm writes a letter, you can forget about the rest of that story ever being followed up on. And that is an extraordinary wrong thing in this country. And that is the death of investigative journalism.
One of the more interesting points I thought that was made was the notion or the belief that politicians hate the press. I think the relationship is more subtle. It is a relationship that I think is closer to that of a Victorian dad, by which I mean that politicians are the Victorian dad. They like authority, they like order, they like deference, and unfortunately, quite often, the scamps within the press.
We have too much information, far too much information, and with less meaning. And we don't need any more information. We need more questions. I think our chair said that earlier. We need more, greater and deeper analysis of how, why, where, and when. It's not lack of information has half the world starving, and it's not lack of information has half the world isolated and disenfranchised, and it's not lack of information that has filthied our water and polluted the planet. That's not lack of information. We have too much information, we have not enough action, and our information has become saturated and meaningless, because if it wasn't, we'd have done something about those things.
I will be basing this exposition on his writings, not on psychoanalyzing his motives, as Ruth suggested might have been an interesting possibility. It would have been very, very interesting, except the little drama last night was based on the words of James Fintan Lalor. He didn't, unfortunately, write much about his Oedipus complex. Lalor is someone who didn't shirk unpopularity and who stuck to his guns, literally, in that he was also an advocate of armed rebellion. He loathed temporising and compromise, so I think he would have been ill at ease in 21st century politics. Would there have been any room in the Ireland of today or of tomorrow for such a man? Unlikely in a political system that doesn't appear to be able to see beyond party discipline.
If we allow wealthy speculators to dictate our future for their ends and not the public good, then further catastrophes await us. On the plinth of the James Fintan Lalor statue outside County Hall in Portlaoise, his words of prophetic warning are inscribed. Let laws and institutions say what they will, this fact will be stronger than all laws and prevail against them. The fact that those who own your land will make your laws and command your liberties and your lives. Let us have an Ireland where every man, woman and child will be equally cherished.
Michael did mention the proclamation, and I do have to quote one section from it, the aims of that was to cherish all our children equally. 100 years on, can we say we've done that as a nation? I think the answer is firmly no. We have not done that. We made strides in lots of areas, but we haven't cherished our children equally. And that's why I actually believe the vision of Ireland has to be based on our children for the future.
But for me, the important issue about Fintan Lalor was that he saw Ireland as a social question, not just a political question of when the British left, or even a question to do with landlords. It was about the whole state of the social order, how people lived, how labourers lived. He had alliances, incidentally, with labour unions and labour groups in Dublin. He supported the progressive elements in the repeal movement and indeed in the Young Irelanders. But he put that social question at the centre, and that's the reason why James Connolly, Jim Larkin, Padraig Pearson, the sovereign people, and indeed a lot of people who came after Fintan Lalor attributed so much to Fintan Lalor for his contribution to the thought process that led to our independence. And I believe his thinking had an influence on the Dáil, the first Dáil, on the 1916 proclamation, and on the subsequent objectives that many people set out in this country. So, how do we move forward from here? I think that what we have to do is to start thinking afresh at the kind of society that we want to build. And I think that that has to be built on something other than markets and something maybe other than economics as we understand it. Now, over my lifetime, I became very, very sceptical about what I would call classical economics. And I'll just give an example of what I mean, just give you a simple equation maybe to make sense of what I'm talking about. If you applied classical economics to nuclear power, you would come to the conclusion it's the cheapest, most efficient and most effective form of power that you could have. All the sums, all the bottom lines, very cheap, very clean, very effective, very, very good. But if you add in the social consequences of one error, or the environmental destruction, or what the people of Japan have faced and the people of 5 Mile Island or what they faced in Middle Europe, then the whole calculation goes out the wall. But we run a society on the first form of calculation, the bottom line, pounds, shillings and pence, what's profitable, what's not profitable, and the social dimension, the environmental consequences and societal impact doesn't even fit in there. And the role of the politician is to try and keep getting these back in somewhere because they're under pressure from the people who elect them to try and do that. And it's almost an impossible task because the fundamentals are at fault.
If James Fintan Lalor was a contrarian, well, I'm in the right place. James Fintan Lalor cared deeply about our national identity and our freedom to be ourselves. I really wonder what he would make of Ireland today. How have we used that freedom that was so hard won? Every Patrick's Day, a friend of mine waffles on about how great it is to be Irish. What an amazing people we are. And I've got to be honest, every year I'm perplexed. I just don't see it that way. I love the land, the earth of Ireland, the soil of Ireland, but the national persona, I'm not so sure about. Remember I said I had to think about what made me feel passionate? Well, drifting away from the earth, the soil of Ireland, what we stand on, is something I feel passionate about preventing. I said I love the earth of Ireland. It's one of my passions. The earth of Ireland may be a resource we own, but that does not mean we have leave to abuse it. And when we forget the land that sustains us, we lose something deeper than our sense of nationality. We lose our humanity. We lose our modesty. We become phone-tapping, iPod-listening, media-mithered egos instead of rounded human beings. I just can't help being fed up of the cant of defining ourselves as a great little country on a well-oiled St. Paddy's Day. I want us to really live up to that moniker. I'm fed up with artifice and bluster. I'm fed up with us adopting the culture of Britain and America while remaining largely narrow-minded and inward-looking. If you don't think we're narrow-minded and inward-looking, try being a mental health advocate.
So, we need to have strong local government with maximum powers devolved from central government. And this must be underpinned by efficiencies in how public money is used and accountability to its citizens. So to conclude, we need economic reform, we need political reform, and this must be at local and national level. But to do this, we need to have greater levels of independence. Not independence to wave flags, Not independence to be isolationist and shut ourselves off in the world, because we can't do that. We have to be part, we have to be world players. But to give ourselves the freedom here on this island to make the decisions and the choices that we need to create a fair, free and sustainable society.